Good evening, friends. Welcome to another tale whispered in the twilight, where the past stirs to life and wraps us in its shadowed secrets. I'm your narrator, and tonight I invite you to walk the cobblestone streets of a small Italian town in 1348, where the air grows heavy and fear begins to murmur. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let the echoes of a forgotten time carry you away to a world where death arrived unannounced, cloaked in rumors and dread. If you're enjoying this journey into the past, please subscribe to the channel so we can keep exploring these stories together. In the town of Cremona, nestled in northern Italy, the cathedral bells still tolled at dusk, calling the faithful to prayer. The streets carried the scent of fresh-baked bread, tanned leather from the workshops, and the sweet tang of grapes hauled in from the countryside. It was a living place, where children darted between market stalls, their laughter mingling with the clatter of carts and the chatter of vendors. The Po River shimmered under the autumn sun, its waters reflecting a town that thrived on trade and community. But beneath this familiar rhythm, something was shifting. Matteo Rossi, a young physician of 26, stood at the edge of the market square, his dark eyes scanning the crowd. He was no stranger to Cremona's pulse-born, a modest house just beyond the city walls. He'd grown up chasing his brothers through these very streets. Trained in medicine at Bologna, Matteo had returned to serve his people, setting broken bones, easing fevers, and delivering babies into the world. His hands were steady, his voice calm, but today, his heart was uneasy. Whispers had reached Cremona, carried by merchants and travelers from the ports of Messina and Genoa. They spoke of a sickness, a shadow that left bodies blackened and towns silenced. At first, the rumors seemed distant, like tales told to frighten children. Ships arriving from the east had brought word of a pestilence that struck without mercy, felling entire families in days. Matteo had overheard the baker Giovanni muttering to a customer about boils the size of eggs and fevers that burned men alive. The old women at the fountain crossed themselves, their voices low as they spoke of God's wrath. Matteo dismissed it as exaggeration, the kind of fear that spreads faster than truth. But then, 3 days ago, a merchant from Sicily collapsed in the market, his face pale, his neck swollen with strange, dark lumps. By nightfall, he was dead. Matteo had seen death before childbirth gone wrong, infections that lingered too long, but this was different. The merchant's body, laid out in the church crypt, was a map of suffering. Blackened sores marred his skin, and his eyes, still open, seemed to stare into some unseen terror. The priests refused to touch him, and the gravediggers worked in silence, their faces wrapped in cloth. Matteo stood at a distance, his leather-bound notebook trembling in his hands as he sketched the symptoms. He didn't know what he was looking at, but he felt it, a weight in the air, like the moment before a storm breaks. That evening, Matteo sat by the fire in his small home, the flicker of flames casting shadows on the walls. His wife Clara mended a shirt across from him, her needle moving in steady rhythm. She was quiet, her brow furrowed, sensing his unease. "What do they say it is, Matteo?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. He hesitated, unsure how to answer. The learned men of Bologna had taught him about miasma's bad air that carried disease, but this felt like something more. "They call it the plague," he said finally, the word heavy on his tongue. Clara's hands paused, and for a moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire. By the next morning, the whispers had grown louder. A second death was reported. A washerwoman who lived near the river. Her daughter, barely 10, had run to the church, screaming that her mother was coughing blood. Matteo was called to the house, his bag of tools slung over his shoulder. The air inside was thick, sour with sweat and something fouler. The woman lay on a straw mattress, her chest heaving, her skin mottled with dark patches. She grasped Matteo's hand, her grip weak but desperate. "Save me," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Matteo murmured promises he wasn't sure he could keep, applying a poultice of herbs he'd learned to use in Bologna. But as he left the house, he knew she wouldn't survive the night. The town began to change. The market, once alive with color and noise, grew quieter. Stalls stood empty, their owners too afraid to venture out. The cathedral, usually packed with worshippers, echoed with the footsteps of a few brave souls. Matteo noticed the glances, now neighbors eyeing each other warily, as if anyone could carry the invisible killer. The baker stopped joking with customers. The children no longer played in the streets, and every night, the church bells rang for the dead, their toll growing more frequent, a grim rhythm that kept Matteo awake. One evening, as Matteo walked home under a sky bruised with clouds, he passed a group of men gathered outside the tavern. Their voices were sharp, edged with panic. "It's the Jews," one hissed, his hands clenched. "They've poisoned the wells." Matteo stopped, his blood running cold. He'd heard such talk before, scapegoats blamed for floods or failed harvests, but this was different. Fear was turning into something darker. He wanted to speak, to argue that no one could control a sickness like this, but the men's eyes were hard, and he kept walking. He didn't want to admit it, but he was afraid to, not just of the plague, but of what it was doing to his town at home. Clara was waiting, her face pale in the candlelight. She'd heard the rumors too, and now she spoke of leaving Cremona. of fleeing to her cousin's village in the hills. Matteo shook his head. "I'm a physician," he said, his voice firmer than he felt. "I can't abandon them." But as he said it, he saw the fear in her eyes, and it cut deeper than any patient's plea. He promised they'd talk again in the morning, but sleep eluded him. He lay awake, listening to the distant toll of the bells, wondering how many more would die before dawn. The next day, the town council summoned Matteo to the Guildhall. The room was dim, the air heavy with the scent of wax and old wood. The councilmen sat at a long table, their faces grim. They spoke of Messina, where half the city was said to be dead, and of Florence, where bodies were piled in the streets. Cremona, they said, could not wait for the same fate. They needed someone to lead, someone to face the sickness head. Matteo felt their eyes on him, and his stomach twisted. He was no hero, just a man who knew how to stitch wounds and brew tonics. But when they asked if he would take up the role of plague doctor, he nodded, unable to find the words to refuse. As he left the Guildhall, the weight of their decision settled on him. He didn't know what being a plague doctor meant, not yet, but he felt the shift, like stepping into a current too strong to fight. The streets of Cremona were quieter now, the laughter gone, replaced by the low murmur of prayers and the creak of shutters closing against the night. Matteo walked home, his footsteps echoing, and for the first time he noticed the smell in the air, not just bread or leather, but something sharp, like rot carried on the wind. This was only the beginning. The plague had arrived, and with it, a darkness that would test Matteo's courage, his faith, and his heart. Tomorrow, he would don a mask that would change him forever, stepping into a role that would haunt his dreams. But for now, he was just a man, standing at the edge of a storm, listening to the whispers in the dark. As we pause here, friends, let the echoes of Cremona linger. In the next chapter, Matteo will face the mask of fate, becoming a plague doctor in a town on the brink. If you're enjoying this tale, please subscribe to the channel. We'll continue this journey together. The toll of Cremona's cathedral bells lingered in the air, their uneven rhythm a grim reminder of the shadow creeping through the town. Matteo Rossi, the young physician who had vowed to face the plague, stood at the edge of a storm, his heart heavy with a choice that would reshape his life. As the morning light filtered through heavy clouds, he prepared to don a mantle that would set him apart, not just from his neighbors, but from the man he once was. Settle in, let the firelight flicker, and walk with him as he steps into a role that will haunt his days and nights. If you're enjoying this journey, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue exploring these tales together. Matteo woke to a sky that seemed to press down on Cremona, muffling its sounds. His small home felt colder than usual, despite the fire Clara had stoked before dawn. She moved quietly, her hands busy with bread and cheese, but her eyes kept finding his, searching for reassurance he couldn't give. "You don't have to do this," she said softly, setting a plate before him. Matteo nodded, his throat tight. He'd agreed to become a plague doctor, but the weight of that choice sat like a stone in his chest. The council's summons from the previous day echoed in his mind, their words both a command and a plea. Cremona needed him, but at what cost? By midday, Matteo stood in the Guildhall's back room, lit by a single candle that cast long shadows across the stone walls. The air smelled of dust and old parchment, mingling with the sharp temps of wax. On a rough wooden table lay the garb of a plague doctor, presented by Lorenzo, a councilman whose stern face bore deep lines of worry. The items were strange, almost otherworldly: a long black cloak, waxed to repel the miasma of the bad air believed to carry the plague, a wide-brimmed hat, leather gloves, and a staff, its wood worn smooth by hands long gone. But it was the mask that drew Matteo's gaze, its presence dominating the room like a silent specter. The mask was a grotesque creation, crafted from leather, with a long curved beak like a bird of prey. Two round glass lenses stared blankly, reflecting the candle's flicker. Red wax sealed the seams, giving it a bloodied look, and a faint herbal scent leaked from within, hinting at the dried lavender and thyme stuffed inside the beak. Lorenzo's voice was low, almost reverent. "It will protect you from the pestilence. The herbs purify the air." Matteo's fingers brushed the mask, its surface cool and unyielding. He wanted to believe in its power, but doubt gnawed at him. He'd studied Galen and Hippocrates in Bologna, learned of balances and humors, but this felt less like medicine and more like stepping into a ritual, a dance with death itself. He lifted the mask, its weight surprising, and slipped it over his face. The world shrank to the view through the glass lenses, dim and distorted. The beak pressed against his nose, the herbs scent sharp and cloying, filling his lungs with each breath. His own breathing echoed inside, loud and unnatural, and for a moment he felt not like a physician but a figure from a nightmare, a creature born of fear. Lorenzo handed him the cloak, and as Matteo draped it over his shoulders, the waxed fabric rustled like dry leaves on a grave. The hat came last, its brim casting a shadow that hid his face even further. He caught his reflection in a polished bronze plate on the wall. A stranger stared back, faceless, inhuman. Stepping into Cremona's streets, Matteo felt the town's eyes on him. The market square, once alive with vendors' shouts and children's laughter, was half empty, the remaining stalls shrouded in unease. His new attire drew gasps and whispers. A young girl clutched her mother's skirts, her eyes wide with fear. An old man crossed himself, muttering a prayer as if warding off evil. Matteo gripped the staff tightly, its weight grounding him against the weight of their stares. He was no longer just Matteo Rossi, the physician who'd set bones and soothed fevers. He was something else now, a symbol of both hope and dread. A man tasked with facing death while the town watched from behind shuttered windows. His first task was to visit the home of a weaver named Paolo, whose wife had fallen ill. The house stood near the Po River, its wooden shutters closed tight, as if they could keep out the plague. Matteo knocked, the staff's thud echoing in the stillness. Paolo opened the door, his face pale, his eyes red from sleepless nights. "She's worse," he whispered, leading Matteo inside. The air was thick with the sour smell of sweat, and something fouler, a stench that clung to the back of Matteo's throat. On a straw mattress lay Anna, Paolo's wife, her skin sallow, her neck swollen with dark egg-sized lumps. She moaned, softly, her eyes half open, unfocused, lost in a fever's haze. Matteo knelt beside her, his cloak brushing the dirt floor. Through the mask's lenses, the room seemed distant, as if he were watching from another world. He checked her pulse. Weak had Raticand, applied a poultice of crushed herbs, a mixture of mint and wormwood he'd learned in Bologna. He knew it was little more than ritual, a gesture to ease her suffering rather than cure it. Anna's hand reached for his, her fingers cold and trembling. "Will I live?" she asked, her voice barely audible, cracked like dry earth. Matteo's mask hid his expression, but his silence spoke louder than words. He murmured a prayer, more for her comfort than his own faith, and rose to leave Dart as he stepped outside. Paolo followed, his voice breaking. "You'll come back, won't you? You'll save her." Matteo wanted to promise, to offer the comfort he'd given countless patients, but the mask seemed to strip away his humanity, leaving only the truth. "I'll try," he said, the words muffled by the beak. He stepped into the street, the river's damp chill seeping through his cloak. Behind him, Paolo's quiet sobs faded, drowned by the distant toll of the cathedral bells. Now a constant dirge for Cremona's dead. That night, Matteo returned home, the mask heavy in his hands. Clara was waiting, her face tight with worry, the firelight casting shadows across her features. She didn't speak as he set the mask on the table, its beak pointing toward the fire like an accusation. "It's begun," he said, his voice low, almost lost in the crackle of the flames. Clara nodded, her hands twisting in her lap. They sat in silence, the weight of the day settling between them like an uninvited guest. Matteo thought of Anna, of the fear in Paolo's eyes, of the mask that had already changed how the town saw him. He wondered if it would change him too, if the man beneath the cloak could remain whole. The next morning brought no reprieve. The bells tolled again, and with them came another summons, this time to a house deeper in Cremona's winding streets. Matteo donned the mask once more, its weight familiar now, though no less oppressive. As he stepped into the dawn, the air carried a new scent, smoke, faint but growing, from fires lit to burn the clothes of the dead. The plague was tightening its grip, and Matteo's role as its adversary was only beginning. He tightened his grip on the staff, the wood warm from his hand, and walked toward the next house, where another family waited, clinging to hope in the face of despair. As we pause here, let the weight of Matteo's mask linger. In the next chapter, we'll follow him into the homes of the sick, where the true horror of the plague reveals itself in whispers and cries. If you're enjoying this tale, subscribe if you like the video, and we'll continue this journey through Cremona's darkened streets together. The smoke from burning clothes lingered in Cremona's air, a faint, acrid reminder of the plague's tightening grip. Matteo Rossi, now cloaked in the eerie garb of a plague doctor, walked through the dawn, his staff tapping the cobblestones like a metronome of dread. The mask's beak pressed against his face, its herbal scent sharp in his nostrils, as he moved toward another summons, another home where hope battled despair. The cathedral bells tolled in the distance, their mournful rhythm blending with the memory of Anna's fevered pleas and Paolo's broken sobs. Matteo's role was new, but already it felt like a chain, binding him to the suffering of a town unraveling. Settle in, let the shadows deepen, and walk with him as he faces the plague's grim reality in the homes of the dying. The morning was damp, the air heavy with mist from the Po River. Matteo's cloak, waxed and stiff, rustled as he navigated Cremona's narrow streets, where shutters remained closed and the usual chatter of neighbors was replaced by silence. His destination was a baker's home, a stone house near the edge of the market square. The summons had come at first light, delivered by a trembling boy who spoke of his father's fever and a sister who could no longer stand. Matteo's heart sank as he approached the door, its wood scarred from years of use. He knocked with his staff, the sound echoing like a warning. The door creaked open, revealing a woman with hollow eyes, Maria, the baker's wife, her hands twisted in her apron, stained with flour and tears. "They're inside," she whispered, stepping aside. The air within was stifling, thick with the stench of sweat and decay, a smell that clung to Matteo's throat despite the masks. Herbs in the main room, lit by a single candle, lay two figures on straw pallets. The baker Tommaso was a broad man, his face flushed with fever, his chest heaving with labored breaths. Beside him, his daughter Sophia, no older than 12, curled into herself, her skin pale, her neck marred by dark, swollen lumps. Matteo knelt beside Tommaso, his gloved hands moving with practiced care. The man's pulse was rapid, his skin hot to the touch. Black sores dotted his arms, some weeping pus, others crusted over. Matteo applied a poultice of mint and wormwood, its sharp scent mingling with the room's foulness. He knew it offered little beyond comfort, but he pressed it gently against the sores, murmuring words of reassurance. Tommaso's eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. "My girl," he rasped, his voice barely audible. "Save my Sophia." Matteo glanced at the child, her breath shallow, her small frame trembling. He nodded, though his heart twisted with the lie. Sophia was worse. Her pulse was faint, her skin clammy, and the lumps on her neck were hard as stones. Matteo tried to spoon a tonic of boiled willow bark into her mouth, but she could barely swallow, her lips cracked and dry. Maria hovered nearby, her hands clasped as if in prayer. "She was singing yesterday," she said, her voice breaking. "She was singing. And now." Matteo's mask hid his expression, but his chest ached. He wanted to tell her there was hope, that Sophia would recover, but the truth was a weight he couldn't shift. He worked in silence, cleaning the sores, adjusting the blankets, each movement deliberate, as if precision could hold back the inevitable. As he left the house, Maria clutched his arm, her fingers digging into the waxed cloak. "You'll come back. You'll try again." Her eyes were wild, searching the blank lenses of his mask for something human. Matteo nodded, his voice muffled. "I'll return tomorrow." But as he stepped into the street, the mist curling around his boots, he knew tomorrow might be too late. Bells tolled again, their sound carrying over the rooftops, and Matteo felt their weight in his bones. The day stretched on, each summons blurring into the next. A tailor's son coughing blood in a cramped attic, an old woman, her hands clutching a rosary as fever consumed her, a merchant, once proud, now whimpering like a child as sores spread across his chest. Each home was the same: a dim room, a straw mattress, the stench of death. Matteo moved through them, his staff a steady rhythm, his mask a barrier between him and the world. The herbs inside the beak lavender thyme, camphor were meant to protect him, but they couldn't shield him from the cries, the pleas, the eyes that followed him, begging for miracles he couldn't perform. By dusk, Matteo's legs ached, his shoulders stiff from the cloak's weight. He stood in the market square, now nearly deserted, the stalls abandoned under the fading light. A single vendor remained, an old man selling wilted herbs, his hands trembling as he packed his wares. Matteo approached, hoping to replenish his supply of mint, but the man shrank back, crossing himself. "Stay away, doctor," he muttered, his voice sharp with fear. Matteo stopped, the rejection stinging more than he expected. He was no longer a neighbor, a healer, but a figure of dread, his mask marking him as both savior and harbinger. That night, Matteo returned home, the mask heavy in his hands. Clara was waiting, her face pale in the firelight, a bowl of stew cooling on the table. She didn't ask about his days, she didn't need to. The slump of his shoulders, the way he set the mask down with care, told her enough. They ate in silence, the crackle of the fire the only sound. Matteo thought of Sophia, her small hand limp in his, and Tommaso's desperate plea. He thought of the tailor's son, the old woman. The mercantile faces now etched into his mind, their suffering a weight he carried home. As he lay in bed, Clara's breathing soft beside him, Matteo stared at the ceiling, the mask's silhouette, visible in the corner where he'd left it. Sleep eluded him, chased away by the memory of those he'd seen that day. He wondered how many would survive until morning, how many names would join the bell's toll. The mask had protected him from the miasma, but nothing could shield him from the guilt, the growing sense that his efforts were as futile as the poultices he applied. Yet he couldn't stop. Cremona needed him, even if it meant becoming a stranger to himself. The next morning, as he donned the mask again, a new summons arrived. A child's cry had been heard in a house near the cathedral, a plea that echoed Sophia's frail voice. Matteo gripped his staff, the wood warm from his hand, and stepped into the streets, where the smoke was thicker now, curling upward like ghosts. The plague was relentless, and Matteo's battle was only beginning. Each step carried him deeper into the heart of Cremona's suffering, where the echoes of the dying would test his resolve and reshape his soul. As we pause here, let the weight of Matteo's day linger, the cries of the sick still echoing in his ears. In the next chapter, we'll follow him as he bears the burden of his staff, navigating a town consumed by fear and loss. Subscribe if you like the video, and we'll continue this journey through Cremona's darkened streets together. The echoes of a child's cry lingered in Matteo Rossi's mind as he stepped into Cremona's mist-shrouded streets. The smoke of burning clothes now a constant veil over the town. His plague doctor's mask, with its long beak and glass lenses, muffled his breaths, but it couldn't silence the memory of Sophia's frail voice or Tommaso's desperate plea. Each day brought new summons, new faces marked by the plague's cruel hand, and Matteo's staff, once a mere tool, now felt like an anchor, grounding him in a world unraveling. The cathedral bells tolled, their rhythm a grim pulse, as he walked toward another home where despair waited. Settle in, let the shadows of Cremona deepen, and follow Matteo as he carries the growing burden of his role, step by heavy step. The morning air was damp, the cobblestones slick under Matteo's boots as he moved through the narrow alleys. Po River's chill seeped into his bones, despite the waxed cloak that shielded him from the miasma. His destination was a carpenter's house near the cathedral, where a child's wail had been reported at dawn. The summons had come from a neighbor, her voice trembling as she spoke of a boy who'd lost his voice to fever. Matteo's heart tightened. He thought of Sophia, her small hand limp in his, and wondered if this child would share her fate. The carpenter's door was ajar, a sliver of darkness spilling out. Matteo knocked with his staff, its thud swallowed by the silence of the street. A woman appeared, her face gaunt, her hair tangled. "It's Luca," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My son, he's burning." She led Matteo inside, where the air was thick with the stench of sickness, sweat, bile, and something sharper, like rot. In a corner, on a pallet of straw, lay Luca, a boy of no more than 8. His chest heaved, his skin flushed, and dark lumps swelled beneath his jaw. A younger sister, unharmed but wide-eyed, clung to a wooden doll in the shadows. Matteo knelt beside Luca, his cloak brushing the dirt floor. The mask's lenses narrowed his world, making the boy seem distant, almost unreal. He checked Luca's pulse fast, thready, and applied a poultice of crushed herbs, their minty scent a fleeting relief in the fetid air. Luca's eyes opened, glassy and unfocused. "It hurts," he whimpered, his voice small but piercing. Matteo's gloved hand steadied the boy's trembling shoulder, but his words caught in his throat. He murmured a promise to ease the pain, though he knew the herbs were no match for the plague's ferocity. The mother, Elena, hovered nearby, her hands twisting a rag. "He's all I have left," she said, her voice cracking. Matteo nodded, his mask hiding the helplessness in his eyes. As he worked, the house seemed to close in around him. The walls, once warm with the scent of sawdust, now held only despair. Matteo's staff leaned against the doorframe, its wood scarred from countless knocks. Each home he entered added to its weight not just the physical strain, but the burden of faces, names, and pleas that followed him. Luca's whimpers joined Sophia's, Tommaso's, the tailor's son, the old woman's rosary-clutching hands all piling onto his shoulders, heavier than the cloak itself. Leaving the carpenter's house, Matteo stepped into a street where the mist had thickened, curling like spirits around the lampposts. Elena's voice followed him, begging him to return by nightfall. He promised he would. But as he walked, the cathedral's shadow loomed, its bells tolling for yet another soul. The town was shrinking, not in size, but in life. Shops stood empty, their windows dark. The laughter of children, once a constant hum, had vanished. Matteo passed a woman burning rags in an alley, her face hidden behind a cloth, her eyes darting away from his mask. He was becoming a ghost in his own town, feared as much as the plague itself. The day wore on, each summons a mirror of the last. A blacksmith's wife, her hands calloused from work, now lay shivering with fever. A scribe, his fingers stained with ink, coughed blood onto his manuscripts. Matteo moved through their homes, his staff tapping a rhythm of duty, his poultices and tonics offering little more than gestures of hope. In one house, a man grabbed his cloak, his voice hoarse with rage. "Why can't you stop it?" he demanded, his wife's body already cold on the floor. Matteo had no answer, only the muffled silence of his mask. He left the man's curses behind, but they clung to him, sharp as thorns. By dusk, Matteo's body ached, his legs from endless walking, his arms from carrying his bag of dwindling supplies. The market square, once a tapestry of color and noise, was a wasteland of abandoned carts. A stray dog nosed at a spilled sack of grain, its ribs stark against its fur. Matteo stopped, his breath loud in the mask. He thought of Clara, waiting, at home, her silence louder than any question. He wanted to go to her, to shed the mask and be Matteo again, not this specter of death. But another summons waited, a widow near the river, her cough heard through the walls. He tightened his grip on the staff and kept walking. Night fell, and Matteo returned to Luca's house as promised. The boy was weaker, his breaths shallow, his mother's face a mask of her own, carved by grief. Matteo applied a fresh poultice, but Luca's eyes no longer opened. Elena knelt beside him, whispering prayers, her voice a fragile thread. Matteo stood, his staff heavy in his hand, and stepped outside. The stars were hidden by smoke, the air thick with the scent of burning. He wondered how many more nights he could endure, how many more faces he could carry. At home, Clara was waiting, the fire low but warm. She didn't speak as he set the mask on the table, its beak glinting in the firelight. He sat across from her, the stew she'd made untouched. "How many today?" she asked finally, her voice soft but steady. Matteo shook his head, unable to count the homes, the names, the eyes. "Too many," he said, his voice breaking. Clara reached for his hand, her touch warm against his cold fingers. For a moment, he was just a man again, but the weight of the staff, leaning against the wall, reminded him of the dawn to come. As he lay in bed, the masked silhouette loomed in the corner, a silent witness to his day. Sleep was a distant hope, chased away by Luca's whimpers, the blacksmith's wife's shivers, the scribe's bloodied pages. Matteo's role as plague doctor was no longer just a duty, it was a chain, binding him to Cremona's suffering. Tomorrow would bring more summons, more homes, more pleas he couldn't answer. But for now, he closed his eyes, clinging to Clara's warmth, as the bells tolled in the distance, marking another loss in the night. As we pause here, let the burden of Matteo's staff settle its weight, a mirror of the town's despair. In the next chapter, we'll follow him into a world where faith and science clash, as priests and prayers challenge his work amidst the chaos. If you're enjoying this tale, subscribe if you like the video, and we'll continue this journey through Cremona's darkened streets together. The bells of Cremona's cathedral tolled through the night, their mournful cadence a constant reminder of the plague's relentless march. Matteo Rossi, his plague doctor's mask a heavy burden, lay awake, haunted by Luca's whimpers and the countless faces of the dying. The weight of his staff, leaning against the wall, seemed to press against his soul, each knock on a door adding to the chain of duty binding him to Cremona's suffering. As dawn broke, the mist from the Po River curled through the streets, carrying the scent of smoke and sorrow. Today, Matteo would face not only the plague but the growing tension between his remedies and the town's faith, a clash that threatened to tear Cremona apart. Settle in, let the firelight flicker, and walk with him as he navigates a world where prayers and science vie for hope in the chaos. The morning was gray, the air damp and heavy, as if the river itself wept for the town. Matteo donned his mask, its beak filled with lavender and thyme, and stepped into the streets, his cloak rustling like whispered secrets. The summons this time came from the cathedral itself, where Father Gregorio, a priest known for his fiery sermons, had called for Matteo's presence. The message was curt, delivered by a trembling altar boy who avoided Matteo's gaze, as if the mask marked him as something unholy. Matteo's stomach tightened. He knew the church's power in Cremona, its ability to sway hearts and minds. The plague had turned neighbors into strangers, and now it seemed to pit faith against reason. As he approached the cathedral, its stone facade loomed through the mist, its spires piercing the sky like silent accusations. The square was nearly empty, save for a few women clutching rosaries, their murmurs blending with the river's distant rush. Inside, the air was cool, scented with incense and wax. Candles flickered on the altar, casting shadows across the pews, where a handful of worshippers knelt, their heads bowed. Father Gregorio stood near the pulpit, his robes dark against the stone, his face stern. "Matteo Rossi," he said, his voice echoing in the vast space. "You tread a dangerous path." Matteo stood still, his staff grounded on the floor, its weight a familiar anchor. "I seek only to help," he said, his voice muffled by the mask. Gregorio's eyes narrowed. "Help, or defy God's will. The pestilence is his judgment, yet you meddle with herbs and potions, as if man can undo divine wrath." The words stung, echoing the whispers Matteo had heard in the street rumors that the plague was punishment, that physicians like him were heretics challenging the heavens. He wanted to argue, to speak of the Hippocratic oath, of his duty to ease suffering. But the priest's gaze was unyielding, and the worshipper's eyes darted toward him. Wary and accusing, Gregorio led Matteo to a side chapel, where a woman lay on a pallet, her breath shallow. She was Marta, a seamstress known for her delicate embroidery, now reduced to a trembling figure, her skin mottled with black sores. "She repents," Gregorio said, "but you would fill her with false hope." Matteo knelt beside her, his gloved hands moving carefully. Her pulse was faint, her fever high. He applied a poultice of mint and camphor, its sharp scent cutting through the chapel's incense. Marta's eyes fluttered open, meeting the glass lenses of his mask. "Am I damned?" she whispered, her voice frail. Matteo's heart twisted. "You are not damned," he said softly, though he wondered if his words reached her through the fever's haze. As he worked, Gregorio watched, his presence heavy. "The people look to you," the priest said, "but they should look to God. Your mask frightens them, your remedies mock their prayers." Matteo's hands paused, the poultice warm against his gloves. He thought of Luca, of Sophia, of the countless others he'd tended, their faces blurring into one. "If God wills their death," he said, his voice steady despite the mask, "then why do we pray for their lives?" Gregorio's face darkened, but he said nothing, turning back to the altar as if dismissing Matteo's words. Outside, the mist had thickened, cloaking Cremona in a ghostly veil. Matteo's next summons took him to a tanner's house where a family of 5 huddled in a single room. The father Giacomo lay on a straw mattress, his cough wet and ragged, his wife and 3 children watching in silence. The room smelled of leather and sickness, the air heavy with fear. Matteo worked quickly, applying tonics and checking pulses. But the eldest son, a boy named Marco, stared at him with defiance. "Father Gregorio says you can't save us," he said, his voice sharp. "He says it's God's will." Matteo met the boy's gaze through his lenses, seeing not just anger but fear. "I'm here to try," he said, but the words felt hollow, drowned by the boy's doubt and the priest's warnings. The day stretched on, each house a mirror of the last. A cobbler's wife, her hands still dusted with chalk, lay feverish, her husband praying loudly as Matteo worked. A young apprentice, his eyes bright with terror, clutched a crucifix as sore spread across his chest. In every home, faith and fear intertwined, prayers mingling with cries of pain. Matteo's staff tapped a relentless rhythm, his cloak heavy with damp and despair. The town's trust in him was fraying, replaced by whispers of divine judgment, and he felt the divide growing between his remedies and their rosaries, between his hope and their resignation. By dusk, Matteo stood in the cathedral square, the mist curling around his boots. A crowd had gathered, drawn by Gregorio's voice, which carried from the church steps. "Turn to God," he thundered, his arms raised. "The pestilence is his call to repentance." The crowd murmured, some nodding, others glancing at Matteo's masked figure with suspicion. A woman spat as he passed, muttering, "Heretic." Matteo's grip tightened on his staff, but he kept walking, the weight of their eyes heavier than the plague itself. At home, Clara waited, her face pale in the firelight. The mask sat on the table, its beak glinting like a blade. "They're turning against you," she said, her voice low. Matteo nodded, too tired to speak. He thought of Marta's whispered question, of Marco's defiance, of Gregorio's accusations. The plague was not just a sickness, it was a force tearing Cremona apart, pitting neighbor against neighbor, faith against reason. He reached for Clara's hand, her warmth a fleeting anchor in the storm. As night fell, Matteo lay awake, the bells tolling in the distance. The mask's silhouette loomed in the corner, a reminder of the role he couldn't escape. Tomorrow, he would face another summons, another clash of prayers and poultices, but for now, he clung to the silence of his home, the only refuge from a town lost in chaos. The cathedral bells of Cremona tolled through the night, their mournful echo mingling with the whispers of prayers and accusations that haunted Matteo Rossi's sleepless hours. The clash between his physician's remedies and Father Gregorio's sermons had left a rift in the town, with Matteo's plague doctor mask marking him as both healer and outcast. The mist from the Po River hung heavy, carrying the acrid scent of smoke and the weight of a town divided by fear. Yet amidst the chaos, a flicker of hope stirred in Matteo, a hope tied to the ancient art of alchemy, a promise of a cure that it might defy the plague's relentless grip. "Settle in, let the shadows of Cremona deepen, and walk with him as he chases a fleeting chance to save the dying." The morning was cold, the air thick with damp as Matteo stepped into the streets, his staff tapping the slick cobblestones, the mask's beak pressed against his face. Its lavender and thyme sent a faint shield against the stench of decay that now clung to Cremona. His cloak, heavy with mist, rustled as he moved toward the edge of town, where an old apothecary's shop stood, its windows dim and shuttered. The summons from the night before hadn't come from a sickbed but from an alchemist named Niccolo, a reclusive figure whose name was whispered with both awe and suspicion. Niccolo had sent word of a possible remedy, a concoction born of fire and herbs that might halt the plague's advance. Matteo's heart quickened at the thought, though doubt lingered like the smoke in the air. The apothecary's shop was a squat stone building, its door marked with faded symbol circles and crosses that hinted at secrets older than Cremona itself. Matteo knocked his staff's thud soft against the weathered wood. The door creaked open, revealing Niccolo, a wiry man with graying hair and eyes that gleamed like polished flint. "You came," he said, his voice low, as if guarding a secret. The air inside was sharp with a scent of burning charcoal and dried herbs, mingled with something metallic, like heated iron. Shelves lined the walls, crowded with jars of roots, leaves, and powders. Their labels faded but precise. A small furnace glowed in the corner, its heat warming the damp chill of the morning. Niccolo led Matteo to a table cluttered with vials and a mortar stained with green residue. "The plague is no ordinary sickness," he said, his hands moving deftly as he crushed dried sage. "It's a corruption of the body's essence, a fire that must be quenched with balance." He spoke of humors, of stars aligning to influence disease, of substances that could purify the blood. Matteo listened, his physician's training warring with the alchemist's mysticism. In Bologna, he'd learned to trust reason pulse fever symptoms, but Niccolo's words stirred a desperate hope. What if there was truth in his art, a key to saving Luca, Marta, or the countless others whose faces haunted him? The alchemist showed Matteo a vial of dark liquid, its surface catching the furnace's glow. "Rosewater, myrrh, and a touch of quicksilver," Niccolo said, swirling the mixture. "Apply to the sores, it draws out the poison." Matteo's fingers tightened on his staff. Quicksilver mercury was dangerous, its effects unpredictable. He'd seen it used in small doses for skin ailments, but the plague was no rash. Still, he nodded, willing to try anything that might ease the suffering he saw daily. Niccolo handed him the vial, along with a bundle of dried herbs, thyme, rosemary, and a bitter root Matteo didn't recognize. "Boil these with wine," the alchemist instructed. "Give it to the sick. It may strengthen them." Matteo left the shop, the vial heavy in his bag, its promise both a spark and a burden. The streets were quieter now, the market square a ghost of its former self. A lone vendor sold wilted greens, his eyes darting away from Mateo's mask. The cathedral loomed in the distance, its bells silent for now, but their echo lingered. In Mateo's mind, a reminder of Father Gregorio's warnings. Would this remedy be seen as defiance? Another mark against him in a town torn by faith and fear. He pushed the thought aside, focusing on the summons that awaited a weaver's family near the river, where 3 had fallen ill. The weaver's house was small, its air thick with the smell of wool and sickness. The mother, Isabella, lay on a pallet, her breath ragged, her neck swollen with lumps. Her 2 sons, barely teenagers, sat nearby, their faces pale but unmarked for now. Mateo knelt beside Isabella, his gloved hands steady as he applied dark liquid to her sores. It stung, drawing a faint moan from her lips, but she was too weak to protest. He boiled the herbs as instructed, the wine's sharp scent filling the room, and spooned the tonic into her mouth. Her sons watched, their eyes wide with a mix of hope and dread. "Will it work?" the elder asked, his voice trembling. Mateo's mask hid his uncertainty. "We'll see," he said, the words muffled but gentle. As he left, the younger son followed him to the door. "Father Gregorio says only prayer can save her," he whispered. Mateo paused, the vial's weight pressing against his side. "Prayer and medicine can walk together," he said, hoping his voice carried conviction. But as he stepped into the street, the mist curling around his boots, he felt the divide widening between Nicolo's alchemy, Gregorio's faith, and his own faltering reason. The days stretched on, each house a test of the alchemist's promise. Mateo applied the quicksilver mixture to sores, boiled herbs for tonics, and watched for signs of improvement. In one home, a merchant's fever seemed to ease, his breathing steadier after the tonic. In another, a child's sores grew worse, the skin blackening beneath the dark liquid. Mateo's notebook filled with observations, but the results were maddeningly inconsistent. Hope flickered, then dimmed like a candle in the wind. The townsfolk watched him warily, some grateful for his efforts, others whispering of witchcraft. A woman in the market spat as he passed, her voice low. "You play with poisons, doctor." By dusk, Mateo's body ached, his hands trembling, from hours of work. The Po River's mist had thickened, shrouding Cremona in a ghostly veil. He stood by the water's edge, the vial of quicksilver heavy in his bag. He thought of Isabella, of the merchant, of the child whose sores had worsened. Nicolo's promise was a fragile thread, fraying with each failure. Yet he couldn't stop, not when Luca's whimpers still echoed in his mind, not when Clara's worried eyes waited at home. He gripped his staff, its wood warm from his hand, and turned toward the next summons. A child's cry piercing the twilight at home. Clara sat by the fire, her needle pausing as Mateo set the mask on the table. Its beak glinted, a silent witness to his day. "Any hope?" she asked, her voice soft. Mateo shook his head. The vials weighed a confession of doubt. "I don't know," he said, his voice breaking. They sat in silence, the fire crackling, the bells tolling in the distance. The alchemist's promise had offered a spark, but the plague's shadow loomed larger, and Mateo's heart wavered between hope and despair. The faint hope sparked by Nicolo's alchemical remedies flickered in Mateo Rossi's heart, fragile against the plague's unyielding shadow. The bells of Cremona tolled through the twilight, their mournful notes blending with the memory of whispered accusations and the bitter scent of quicksilver. Mateo's staff, worn smooth by endless summons, tapped the cobblestones as he moved through the mist, the weight of his plague doctor's mask, a constant reminder of his role as both healer and outcast. The Po River's damp chill clung to his cloak, and the cries of the sick echoed in his mind Isabella's ragged breaths. The merchant's fleeting relief, the child whose sores had blackened. Now, a new summons drew him to a home where a child's voice pierced the darkness, a plea that would test his resolve like never before. Settle in, let the firelight dim, and walk with Mateo as he faces a moment that cuts deeper than any he has known. The evening was heavy, the mist so thick it seemed to swallow the stars. Mateo's boots slipped on the slick stones as he approached a modest house near the cathedral. Its wooden door cracked and weathered. The summons had come from a neighbor, her voice trembling as she spoke of a girl begging for her mother's life. Mateo knocked, his staff's thud, soft but deliberate, and the door opened to reveal a child, no older than 10, her face pale and streaked with tears. Her name was Chiara, and her eyes, wide with desperation, met the glass lenses of Mateo's. "Mask, please," she whispered, her voice raw. "Mama's dying." Inside, the air was thick with the stench of sickness, sweat, bile, and the sharp rot that had become Mateo's constant companion. A single candle flickered on a table, casting shadows across a straw pallet where a woman lay, her breaths shallow and uneven. This was Beatrice, Chiara's mother, a widow who wove baskets to sell in the market. Her skin was sallow, her neck swollen with dark lumps, and her hands twitched as if reaching for something lost. Chiara clung to her side, her small fingers wrapped around her mother's wrist. "She was fine 2 days ago," Chiara said, her voice breaking. "She was singing to me." Matteo knelt beside Beatrice, his cloak brushing the dirt floor. The masks, herbs, lavender, thyme, camphor did little to mask the room's foulness. He checked her pulse, faint and erratic, and applied Nicolo's quicksilver mixture to her sores, its sting drawing a faint moan from her lips. He boiled the alchemist's herbs with wine, the steam rising like a prayer, and tried to spoon the tonic into her mouth. Beatrice's lips parted, but the liquid dribbled down her chin, her strength too far gone. Chiara watched, her eyes never leaving Matteo's mask, as if searching for a face that could promise salvation. "You'll save her, won't you?" Chiara asked, her voice small but fierce. "You're the doctor. You can make her better." Matteo's heart twisted, the weight of her hope heavier than his staff. He wanted to tell her yes, to promise that Beatrice would rise and sing again, but the truth was a blade he couldn't wield. "I'm trying," he said, his voice muffled, soft as a whisper through the beak. He adjusted the blanket over Beatrice, his gloved hand steady despite the ache in his chest. Chiara's gaze didn't waver, her belief in him, a fragile thread stretched to breaking dot as he worked. Memories of other children, Luca, Sophia, flooded back, their faces blurring into Chiara's. Each plea, each pair of eyes, added to the burden. Matteo carried a weight that grew with every home he entered. He thought of Father Gregorio's warnings, of the townsfolk's accusations, of Nicolo's uncertain remedies. Nothing seemed enough, not his training, not the alchemist's promise, not the prayers that echoed in Cremona streets. Yet Chiara's voice, small and unyielding, held him there, demanding he try. Even as hope slipped through his fingers like mist, he stayed longer than he should have, reapplying the poultice, checking Beatrice's fever, whispering words of comfort that felt hollow. Chiara sat beside him, clutching her mother's hand, her tears falling silently. "She's all I have," she said, her voice barely audible. Matteo nodded, his mask hiding the pain in his eyes. He thought of Clara waiting at home, her own worry a mirror of Chiara's. He wanted to stay, to fight for Beatrice until the end. But another summons waited, a blacksmith near the river, his cough heard through the walls. Matteo rose, his staff heavy in his hand, and promised Chiara he'd return by morning. The night was dark, the mist a shroud that muffled Cremona's sounds. Matteo moved through the streets, his cloak damp and heavy, the memory of Chiara's plea a weight he couldn't shake. Other homes called to him, each a variation of the same tragedy. The blacksmith, his hands blackened from work, now lay trembling, his wife weeping as Matteo applied the quicksilver. A young girl, her hair braided with care, coughed blood onto her pillow, her father's prayers drowning out Matteo's instructions. Each face, each voice, joined the chorus in his mind, a litany of loss that grew louder with every step. By dawn, Matteo's body ached, his legs unsteady from hours of walking, his hands raw inside the gloves. The cathedral square was empty, save for a lone woman burning rags, her face hidden behind a cloth. The bells tolled, their rhythm a grim tally of the night's losses. Matteo thought of Beatrice, of Chiara's desperate eyes, and wondered if he'd return to find her mother gone. The alchemist's remedies had offered fleeting hope, but the plague's grip was stronger, and Matteo's faith in his own hands wavered. He returned to Chiara's house as promised. The morning mist still thick, the air sharp with smoke. Chiara opened the door, her face paler, her eyes redder. Beatrice lay still, her chest barely rising, her skin colder than before. Matteo knelt, his movements mechanical, applying the poultice, checking her pulse. Chiara watched, silent now, her hope fading like the candle's flame. "She's not singing anymore," she whispered, and Matteo felt the words like a blow. He stayed until Beatrice's breaths grew fainter, until Chiara's hand slipped from her mother's. There was no miracle, no cure, only the quiet of a life slipping away as he left. Chiara's voice followed him. "Don't go," she said. But Matteo could only nod, his mask a barrier between them. The street was silent, the mist curling around his boots like ghosts. He thought of Clara, of the warmth of their home, but even that felt distant now, overshadowed by the weight of his failure. The plague was a thief, stealing not just lives but the belief that he could make a difference at home. Clara waited, the fire low but warm. She didn't speak as Matteo set the mask on the table, its beak glinting like a silent accusation. He sat, his hands trembling, and told her of Chiara, of Beatrice, of the hope that had slipped away. Clara's hand found his hurt touch a lifeline, but even her warmth couldn't erase the child's plea echoing in his mind. The bells tolled again, and Matteo knew tomorrow would bring more summons, more faces, more weight. The weight of Chiara's plea clung to Matteo Rossi like the mist that shrouded Cremona. Her whispered words, "Don't go," echoing alongside the cathedral bells that marked another dawn of loss. The plague doctor's mask, its beak heavy, with the scent of lavender and thyme, hid Matteo's grief. But it couldn't shield him from the memory of Beatrice's fading breaths or the countless faces that haunted his sleepless nights. His staff tapped the cobblestones, each step a reminder of the burden he carried through a town unraveling at its seams. Now, a new decree from Cremona's council would deepen the scars of fear, forcing Matteo to stand at the heart of a community turning against itself. Settle in, let the shadows of Cremona thicken, and walk with him as he faces the quarantine wall. where hope and humanity fray under the plague's relentless grip. The morning air was sharp, the Po River's chill seeping through Mateo's waxed cloak as he moved through streets that felt emptier with each passing day. The summons this time came not from a sickbed but from the Guildhall where the council had gathered to issue a desperate edict. The plague's toll was climbing. Mateo had seen it in Chiara's tear-streaked face, in the blackened sores of the dying, in the smoke that rose from burning rags. Cremona could no longer wait for miracles. The council's plan was stark, a quarantine wall, both physical and invisible, to seal off the infected and halt the pestilence's spread. Mateo's role, they said, was to enforce it, to mark the homes of the sick and ensure no one crossed the line. The Guildhall was dim, its air heavy with the scent of wax and fear. Lorenzo, the stern councilman, stood at the head of the table, his face etched with exhaustion. "The healthy must be spared," he said, his voice low but unyielding. "You'll mark the doors with a cross, red as blood, so all know to stay away." Mateo's grip tightened on his staff, the wood warm from his hand. He thought of Chiara alone now in her marked home, and of the families he'd tended, their eyes pleading for salvation. "And the sick?" he asked, his voice muffled by the mask. Lorenzo's gaze hardened. "They stay inside, no exceptions." Mateo nodded, but his heart sank, knowing the quarantine would trap the desperate as much as the diseased. His first task was to mark the homes along the river where the plague had struck hardest. The streets were silent, save for the distant toll of bells and the creak of shutters closing against the world. Mateo carried a pot of red paint, its metallic scent sharp in the morning mist. At Atana's house, where he'd tended a feverish wife days before, he dipped his brush and painted a cross on the door, its crimson stark against the weathered wood. Inside he heard a cough, then silence. He knocked, his staff's thud heavy, and called out, "Stay within. It's for the town's safety." Voice weak, angry replied, "You're locking us in to die." Mateo had no answer, only the weight of the brush in his hand. As he moved from house to house, the red crosses multiplied, each one a wound on Cremona's heart. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, their eyes sharp with fear and suspicion. At a weaver's home, a man shouted from an upper window, "You're no doctor, you're a jailer." Mateo kept his head down, the mask hiding his shame, but the words cut deep. He thought of Niccolo's quicksilver, of the tonics that had failed Beatrice, of Chiara's hope fading like a candle's flame. The quarantine was meant to protect, but it felt like betrayal, turning him into a gatekeeper of despair. By midday, the town's divisions grew sharper. Near the market square, a crowd had gathered, their voices raised in anger. A merchant, his face flushed, pointed at Mateo's masked figure. "He marks our homes, but he can't save us." Others nodded, their fear turning to rage. A woman clutched a rosary, her lips moving in prayer, while a young man spat, "The Jews brought this, not us." Mateo's blood ran cold, remembering the whispers he'd heard days before. The plague was a spark, igniting old hatreds, and the quarantine only fanned the flames. He wanted to speak, to defend his work, but the masks silenced him. Its beak a barrier between reason and rage. Mateo's next stop was Chiara's house, its door already marked by another's hand-accrued red cross, smeared as if painted in paste. He knocked, his heart heavy, and Chiara opened the door, her face paler than before. "They won't let me out," she said, her voice small. "They say I'll spread it." Mateo knelt, his cloak pooling on the ground. "You're safe here," he lied, knowing the quarantine offered no protection from grief. He checked the house for supplies, finding only a half loaf of bread and a jug of water. "I'll bring more," he promised, but Chiara's eyes were distant, fixed on the empty pallet where her mother had lain. He left her with a tonic, its bitter scent lingering, and stepped back into the street, the red cross glaring like an accusation. The day wore on, each marked door a weight on Mateo's soul. He tended the sick where he could, applying poultices and whispering reassurances. But the quarantine made his visits brief, hurried. In one home, a family begged to leave, their voices rising as he painted their door. In another, a man slipped him a coin, pleading for his children to be spared the mark. Mateo refused, his hands shaking, knowing the council's eyes were everywhere. The town was splitting, those inside the marked homes, trapped with the plague, and those outside, clinging to a fragile hope that soon turned to blame. By dusk, Mateo stood in the cathedral square, the mist curling around his boots. The crowd had grown, their voices a low roar. Father Gregorio stood on the church steps, his arms raised, preaching of God's wrath and repentance. His eyes found Mateo sharp with disdain. "The doctor locks away the innocent," he said, and the crowd murmured, their anger turning toward the masked figure. A stone skittered across the cobblestones, stopping near Mateo's feet. He gripped his staff, his heart pounding, and walked away, the weight of their hatred heavier than the paint pot in his hand. At home, Clara waited, her face pale in the firelight. The mask sat on the table, its beak glinting like a silent judge. "They're turning on each other," Mateo said, his voice low. Clara nodded, her hands twisting in her lap. "And on you," she said, her voice steady but laced with fear. They sat in silence, the fire crackling, the bells tolling in the Distance. The quarantine wall was more than wood and painted was a line drawn through Cremona's heart. And Matteo stood on its edge, torn between duty and despair. That as we pause here, let the weight of the red crosses linger, a symbol of a town divided. In the next chapter, we'll follow Matteo as he faces the fires of the night, burning the past to save the future as Cremona's losses mount. Subscribe if you like the video, and we'll continue this journey through Cremona's darkened streets, together. The red crosses painted on Cremona's doors burned in Matteo Rossi's mind, each one a scar on a town divided by fear and plague. The cathedral bells tolled through the mist, their mournful cadence a reminder of the quarantine's grim toll, of Chiara's tearful plea, and the crowd's growing anger that followed Matteo like a shadow. His plague doctor's mask, heavy with the scent of lavender and thyme, hid his wariness, but it couldn't shield him from the stone that had skittered across the cobblestones, a silent threat from a town turning on itself. Now a new task, awaited one that would set the night ablaze and sear the past into ashes. Settle in, let the firelight flicker, and walk with Matteo as he faces the grim duty of burning Cremona's losses, where every flame carries a memory and a cost. The evening was dark, the Po River's mist thick enough to choke the stars. Matteo stood in the cathedral square, his staff grounded on the slick cobblestones, as Lorenzo, the councilman, delivered the latest decree. The infected homes must be cleansed, he said, his voice low, his eyes avoiding Matteo's masked gaze. Clothes, bedding, bodies, burn them all. The miasma lingers in their fibers. Matteo's heart sank, the weight of his staff heavier than ever. He thought of Chiara's empty pallet, of the tanner's cough behind a marked door, of the lives reduced to ash before they'd even ended. And the families, he asked, his voice muffled by the beak. Lorenzo's jaw tightened. They stay quarantined. You'll oversee the fires. Matteo's first task was a house near the river, its red cross glowing faintly in the torchlight. The air was sharp with the scent of damp wood and decay, the mist curling around his boots as he approached. A group of gravediggers waited, their faces wrapped in cloth, their eyes darting nervously. They carried torches, their flames spitting in the damp air, and a cart piled with straw and kindling. The house belonged to a cobbler, his family among the first Matteo had tended weeks ago. Now only silence came from within, the plague having, which claimed its toll. Matteo knocked, his staff's thud hollow, and called out, "Open the door." No answer came, but the faint smell of death seeped through the cracks. The gravediggers forced the door, its hinges groaning. Inside the air was thick, the stench of rot overwhelming despite Matteo's mask. On a straw mattress lay the cobbler, his body still, his skin blackened with sores. His wife and son lay nearby, their hands clasped as if in a final embrace. Matteo's chest tightened. He remembered the cobbler's gruff voice, begging for his son's life, now silenced forever. The gravediggers moved quickly, dragging bedding and clothes to the cart, their movements mechanical. Matteo stood frozen, his staff useless, as they doused the pile with oil. A torch touched the straw, and flames roared to life, their heat stinging Matteo's face through the mask's lenses. The fire crackled, its light casting shadows across the street. Neighbors peered from behind shutters, their faces pale, some crossing themselves, others turning away. The flames devoured the cobbler's life as tools, his wife's woven shawl, the wooden horse his son once played with. Matteo watched, the smoke stinging his eyes, the weight of his failure heavier than the staff in his hand. He thought of Chiara alone in her marked home, and wondered if her mother's belongings would soon burn too. The night stretched on, each fire a mirror of the last. A tailor's home, its red cross stark against the door, went up in flames, the scent of burning cloth mingling with the river's damp. A baker's house, where Matteo had tended a feverish daughter, was reduced to ash, the crackle of flames drowning out the memory of her laughter. Matteo moved with the gravediggers, his cloak heavy with soot, his role shifting from healer to destroyer. The townsfolk watched from a distance, their whispers sharp with fear and blame. "He burns our homes," one muttered, "but he can't stop the plague." Matteo kept his head down, the mask hiding his shame, but their words cut deeper than the fire's heat. At a weaver's house, the task grew heavier. The family was still alive, quarantined within, their coughs audible through the walls. Matteo knocked, his voice steady despite the knot in his chest. "Bring out the infected items," he called. A woman's voice, weak but defiant, replied, "You'll burn us next." Matteo's hand froze on his staff. He wanted to explain, to promise safety, but the red cross on the door spoke louder than his words. The gravediggers pried open a window, pulling out blankets and clothes, ignoring the family's pleas. The fire roared to life, its light illuminating. The woman's face pressed against the glass, her eyes wide with terror. Matteo turned away, the flames' heat searing his back. By midnight, the town glowed with scattered fires, their smoke thickening the mist into a choking haze. Matteo's legs ached, his hands raw inside the gloves, the staff a crutch now as much as a symbol. He stood by the river, the water reflecting the flames like a sky turned upside down. The bells tolled, their rhythm a dirge for Cremona's past. Matteo thought of the cobbler's wooden horse, the weaver's tearful eyes, the lives reduced to ash. The quarantine had trapped the sick, but the fires were burning the town's soul, and Matteo was their unwilling torchbearer. A voice broke, his thoughts a young boy, no older than Chiara, standing at the edge of the firelight. "Why do you burn everything?" he asked, his voice trembling. Matteo knelt, his cloak pooling on the ground, his mask making him a stranger. "To stop the sickness," he said, the words hollow even to him. The boy's eyes narrowed, his small fists clenched. "You burned my sister's doll." Matteo had no answer, only the weight of the staff and the smoke that stung his lungs. He rose, turning back to the flames, the boy's words joining the chorus of guilt in his mind. At home Clara waited, the fire low but steady. The mask sat on the table, its beak glinting like a blade in the firelight. Matteo sank into a chair, his body heavy with soot and sorrow. "They hate me," he said, his voice breaking. Clara's hand found her touch warm but fleeting. "They're afraid," she said, her voice soft. "They don't know what else to do." The bells tolled again, and Matteo closed his eyes. The fires still burning behind them, each one a memory he couldn't erase. As dawn approached, Matteo knew the next day would bring more summons, more homes to mark, more fires to light. The plague was a thief, stealing lives and leaving ashes in its wake. Matteo's role as plague doctor had become a pyre, burning away the past he'd sworn to protect. Yet he couldn't stop, not while Cremona still breathed, however faintly. The glow of last night's fires still lingered in Matteo Rossi's mind, their crackle mingling with the cathedral bells that tolled through Cremona's dawn. The plague had turned homes to ash, leaving red-crossed doors and the boy's accusation, "You burned my sister's doll," to haunt Matteo's steps. His plague doctor's mask, heavy with the scent of lavender and thyme, hid his wariness, but it couldn't shield him from the weight of his staff or the memory of a town burning its past. The Po River's mist hung low, cloaking the streets, in a ghostly veil, as Matteo faced a new day in a Cremona stripped of its heartbeat. Settle in, let the shadows deepen, and walk with him as he wanders through a silent market, where the world he knew lies transformed by loss. The morning was cold, the air sharp with a scent of smoke and river damp. Matteo's cloak, stained with soot, rustled as he moved through the narrow streets, his staff tapping a rhythm that echoed in the stillness. The market square, once a vibrant tapestry of voices and colors, was his destination, not for a summons, but for a moment, breathe, to see what remained of Cremona's soul. The square was a shadow of itself, its cobblestones bare save for a few abandoned carts, their wheels creaking in the breeze. The stalls, once piled with bread, fruit, and cloth, stood empty, their awnings tattered. A single vendor, an old woman, with trembling hands, sold wilted herbs, her eyes avoiding Matteo's mask as if it carried the plague itself. Matteo stood at the square's edge, the memory of its former life vivid in his mind. He could still hear the vendor's shouts, the laughter of children chasing stray dogs, the clink of coins as merchants haggled. He remembered Clara buying apples here, her smile bright as she tossed one to him, the fruit's sweetness a fleeting joy. Now, the silence was deafening, broken only by the distant toll of bells and the rustle of leaves skittering across the stones. The market was Cremona's heart, and it had stopped beating, its pulse stolen by fear and death. A faint sound drew Matteo's attention, a soft sob from behind a cart. He approached, his staff grounded, and found a boy, no older than 12, curled against a wheel. His name was Antonio, a baker's son Matteo had tended weeks ago, when his father still lived. Antonio's face was smudged with dirt, his eyes red from crying. "They're all gone," he whispered, clutching a small cloth bag. Matteo knelt, his cloak pooling on the ground, the mask's lenses reflecting the boy's grief. "Who's gone?" he asked, his voice soft but muffled. Antonio's voice broke. "Mama, Papa, my sister. The fire took their things last night." Matteo's heart twisted, remembering the flames that had devoured the baker's home, the ashes that they held their lives. He reached out, his gloved hand resting on Antonio's shoulder. "You're not alone," he said, the words feeling fragile against the boy's loss. Antonio shook his head, his fingers tightening on the bag. "I hid this," he said, opening it to reveal a small wooden spoon, its handle carved with flowers. "It was Matteo nodded, the weight of the boy's grief joining the chorus of voices in his mind. Chiara's plea, the cobbler's silence, the weaver's tearful eyes. He wanted to stay, to offer more than words, but a shout broke the moment. "Plague, doctor," a woman's voice, sharp with urgency, called from across the square. Matteo rose, his staff heavy, and followed the sound to a narrow alley where a woman stood, her face pale, her hands twisting a shawl. "My husband," she said, leading him to a small house marked with a red cross. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of sickness, the room dim despite the morning light. Her husband, a carpenter named Dario, lay on a straw pallet, his cough wet and ragged, his neck swollen with lumps. Matteo worked quickly, applying a poultice of Nicolo's herbs, its bitter scent cutting through the room's foulness. Dario's eyes opened, glassy and unfocused. "The market," he rasped. "Will it ever come back?" Matteo had no answer, only the memory of the silent square, its emptiness a mirror of the town's despair. As he left, the woman pressed a coin into his hand, her fingers trembling. "For your work," she said. Matteo shook his head, returning the coin. "Keep it for food," he said, knowing how little remained in Cremona's stalls. He stepped back into the square, where Antonio still sat, clutching his mother's spoon. The boy's eyes followed him, a silent plea for something Matteo couldn't give a world untransformed by plague. Matteo turned away, his staff tapping the stones, and moved toward the next summons, a house near the cathedral where a child's fever had worsened. The day stretched on, each visit a reminder of Cremona's collapse. A seamstress, her hands still threaded with needle and cloth, lay dying, her shop empty of customers. A merchant, once proud, now begged for news of trade, as if the market's silence could be undone. Matteo's poultices and tonics offered little, their effects flitting against the plague's grip. The square remained a constant backdrop, its emptiness a wound he passed with every step. By dusk, his legs ached, his cloak heavy with damp and soot, the mask's weight pressing harder against his soul. As night fell, Matteo stood in the square once more, the mist curling around the abandoned carts. A single lantern flickered, its light weak against the darkness. He thought of Antonio's wooden spoon, of Dario's rasped question, of the market that had once been Cremona's lifeblood. The plague had stolen more than lives. It had taken the town's rhythm, its laughter, its hope. Matteo's staff felt heavier now, each tap a reminder of the world he couldn't restore at home. Clara waited, the fire low but warm. The mask sat on the table, its beak glinting in the firelight, a silent witness to the day's losses. Matteo sank into a chair, his hands trembling. "The market's gone," he said, his voice low. Clara's eyes met his, her silence heavy. "With understanding, it'll come back," she said, her voice soft but firm. "It has to." Matteo wanted to believe her, but the memory of the silent square, of Antonio's tear-streaked face, weighed too heavily. The bells tolled, their sound carrying through the night, a dirge for a world transformed. The silent market square of Cremona lingered in Matteo Rossi's heart, its empty stalls and abandoned carts, a stark reflection of a town unmade by plague. The cathedral bells tolled through the night, their mournful echo blending with the memory of Antonio's tear-streaked face and the carpenter's rasped question about a world that might never return. Matteo's plague doctor's mask, heavy with the scent of lavender and thyme, hid his exhaustion, but it couldn't shield him from the weight of his staff or the growing doubt that gnawed at his soul. Each Red Cross door, each burned home, each unanswered plea. Chiara's, Sophia's, Lucas had built a burden he could no longer ignore. Now, as the mist thickened and the Po River's chill seeped into his bones, Matteo faced a reckoning within himself, a confession that threatened to break him. Settle in, let the shadows of Cremona deepen, and walk with him as he wrestles with doubt and defiance in a town consumed by despair. The morning was gray, the air heavy with the scent of smoke and damp earth. Matteo donned his mask, its beak pressing against his face, and stepped into the streets, his cloak rustling like a whisper of the past. The summons this time came from a house near the cathedral, where a family of 4 had fallen ill. But as he walked, his steps slowed, his staff dragging against the cobblestones. The weight of the past weeks pressed down the alchemist's failed remedies, Father Gregorio's accusations, the townsfolk's growing hatred. Matteo had sworn to save Cremona, but each day brought more death, and the thought of fleeing, of leaving the mask behind, crept into his mind like a thief. The house was small, its red cross stark against the door. Matteo knocked, his staff's thud soft but deliberate, and a man opened the door, his face pale, his eyes hollow. "They're all sick," he said, leading Matteo inside. The air was thick with the stench of sweat and decay, the room dim despite the morning light. On straw pallets lay a woman and 2 children, their breaths ragged, their skin mottled with sores. The man Pietro hovered nearby, his hands trembling as he clutched a cloth. "Can you save them?" he asked, his voice breaking. Matteo knelt, his gloved hands moving mechanically, applying Niccolo's quicksilver mixture, its sting drawing faint moans from the woman. But his mind was elsewhere, tangled in doubt. That as he worked, Pietro's voice grew desperate. "You're the doctor, you must know something." Matteo's hands paused, the mask hiding the uncertainty in his eyes. He thought of the merchant whose fever had eased, only to return with vengeance, of Chiara whose mother had slipped away despite his efforts, of the fires that burned Cremona's past. "I'm trying," he said, his voice muffled, but the words felt like a lie. Pietro's face hardened, his voice rising. "Trying isn't enough. My children are dying." Matteo stood, his staff heavy in his hand, and murmured a promise to return. But Pietro's words followed him, sharp as a blade. "You're no savior." The street outside was silent, the mist curling around Matteo's boots like ghosts. He leaned against a wall, the mask's weight unbearable. For the first time, he lifted it off, the cool air stinging his face. He breathed deeply, the scent of river and smoke replacing the herb's cloying sweetness. Without the mask, he was Matteo again, not the plague doctor, not the outcast. Just a man who had studied medicine in Bologna, who had loved Clara under Cremona's sunlit skies. But that man felt distant, buried under the weight of failure. He thought of fleeing, of taking Clara and running to the hills where the plague might not follow. The temptation was a whisper, soft but insistent, promising release from the endless summons. Another call broke his thoughts, a shout from the market square, where a crowd had gathered. Matteo replaced the mask, its weight settling back onto his shoulders, and walked toward the noise. The square, still silent in its emptiness, was now filled with voices, sharp with anger. A woman stood at its center, her hands raised, accusing a neighbor of spreading the plague. "She touched my door," she cried, pointing at an older woman who shrank back, clutching a basket of wilted greens. The crowd murmured, their fear turning to rage, and Matteo saw the spark of violence in their eyes, the same spark that had sent a stone skittering across the cobblestones days before. He stepped forward, his staff loud against the stones. "Enough," he called, his voice muffled but firm. The crowd turned, their eyes narrowing at his mask. "You mark our homes," a man shouted, "but you can't stop this." Matteo's heart pounded, the temptation to flee rising again. He wanted to tear off the mask, to tell them he was as frightened as they were, but the weight of his role held him fast. "I'm doing what I can," he said, but the words were lost in the crowd's roar. A hand grabbed his cloak, pulling him back, and for a moment he thought of the stone, of the hatred that could turn to something worse. A voice cut through the chaos. Father Gregorio, standing on a cart, his robes dark against the mist. "Turn to God," he thundered. "The doctor's remedies are folly." The crowd quieted, their eyes shifting between Matteo and the priest. Matteo stood still, his staff grounded, the mask a barrier against their gaze. He wanted to defy Gregorio, to argue that medicine was no sin, but doubt silenced him. What if the priest was right? What if his efforts were futile, a defiance of fate? He turned away, the crowd's murmurs following him, and walked toward the next summons, his steps heavy with indecision. The day wore on, each house a mirror of his doubt. A young girl, her cough weak, stared at him with fading hope. A father, his hands calloused from work, begged for a cure that didn't exist. Matteo's poultices and tonics felt like gestures, empty as the market square. By dusk, his body ached, his mind a tangle of guilt and defiance. He stood by the Po River, the water reflecting the fading light, and thought of Clara, of the life they'd planned before the plague. The temptation to flee grew stronger, a voice whispering that he could leave the mask, the staff, the red crosses behind that home. Clara waited, the fire low but warm. The mask sat on the table, its beak glinting, like a silent judge. Matteo sank into a chair, his hands trembling. "I don't know if I can do this," he confessed, his voice barely audible. Clara knelt beside him, her hand on his. "You're still trying," she said, her voice steady. "That's enough." But Matteo shook his head, the weight of Pietro's words, Gregorio's accusations, and his own doubt pressing down. The bells tolled, their sound a reminder of the lives he couldn't save, and Matteo wondered if defiance was all he had left. The weight of Matteo Rossi's confession lingered in the quiet of his home, his whispered doubt, "I don't know if I can do this," echoing alongside the cathedral bells that tolled through Cremona's night. The plague doctor's mask, its beak glinting in the firelight, stood as a silent witness to his struggle, a symbol of the defiance that held him to a town consumed by despair. The silent market, the Red Cross doors, the fires that burned away the pastel had deepened, the rift between Matteo's heart and the physician he'd sworn to be. Yet, amidst the darkness, a faint flicker of hope stirred, fragile as a lantern in the mist. "Settle in, let the shadows of Cremona soften, and walk with Matteo as he finds a fleeting moment of light in a world shrouded by loss." The dawn was cold, the Po River's mist curling through the streets like a shroud, carrying the faint scent of smoke and decay. Matteo donned his mask, its lavender and thyme scent sharp in his nostrils, and stepped into the town, his staff tapping the slick cobblestones. The summons this time came from a house near the cathedral square, where a family had survived the plague's cruel torture, rare spark in a sea of sorrow. Matteo's steps quickened, his heart lifting at the thought of life enduring, even as doubt clung to him like the damp on his cloak. The memory of Chiara's plea, Antonio's wooden spoon, and Pietro's angry words weighed heavy, but the promise of survivors offered a thread of purpose. The house was modest, its door unmarked by the red cross that had become Cremona's grim signature. Matteo knocked, his staff's thud soft but steady, and a woman opened the door, her face weary but alive. Her name was Lucia, a baker's widow whose husband had perished weeks ago. She led Matteo inside where the air was warm with the scent of fresh bread, a rarity in a town where ovens had gone cold. On a wooden bench sat two children, their faces thin but flushed with life, their eyes bright despite the shadows of loss. "They're better," Lucia said, her voice trembling with relief. "The fever broke yesterday." Matteo knelt beside the children, a boy and girl no older than 10 and 7. Their pulses were strong, their skin free of sores, their breaths steady. He checked their necks, finding no trace of the lumps that had claimed so many. "How?" he asked, his voice muffled by the mask, a spark of wonder breaking through his doubt. Lucia's hands twisted in her apron. "I don't know," she said. "I prayed. I gave them your tonics. I kept them warm." Matteo nodded, his gloved hand resting on the boy's shoulder. The alchemist's remedies, the prayers, the simple act of care, something had worked. A small victory against the plague's grip. He lingered longer than needed, adjusting blankets, offering a fresh tonic of boiled herbs and wine. The boy, Matteo's namesake, grinned shyly, holding up a small loaf of bread. "Mama made it," he said, his voice soft but clear. Matteo took the bread, its warmth seeping through his gloves, a reminder of the market's lost days. The girl, Elena, hummed a tune, her voice faint but steady, and for a moment Matteo heard Cremona as it once was, alive, vibrant, unbroken. He smiled beneath the mask, though they couldn't see it, and murmured thanks, his heart lighter than it had been in weeks. As he left, Lucia pressed a small loaf into his hands. "For you," she said, her eyes meeting the glass lenses of his mask, "for not giving up." Matteo nodded, the bread's warmth a fragile anchor against the weight of his doubt. He stepped into the street, the mist curling around his boots, and for the first time in days, he felt a flicker of hope, a lantern in the darkness. Small but stubborn. The day stretched on, but the memory of Lucia's family carried Matteo through the grim routine. He tended to a merchant whose fever had eased, his cough less ragged than before. In another home, a young woman, her sores fading, sat up to sip water, her mother weeping with relief. These were not cures. Matteo knew the plague's tricks too well, but they were moments of life, glimmers of resilience in a town buried in ash. Yet the losses still came. A child's cough turned to silence in a red-crossed house. An old man, his rosary clutched tight, slipped away as Matteo applied a poultice. Each victory was tempered by defeat, each lantern dimmed by the plague's shadow. By dusk, Matteo stood in the cathedral square, the mist thick and the bells tolling. A small crowd gathered, their faces softer now, some nodding as he passed. Word of the survivors had spread, a whisper of hope in a town starved for it. A woman approached, her hands trembling as she offered a sprig of rosemary. "For your mask," she said, her voice low, "for trying." Matteo took the herb, its sharp scent mingling with the lavender, and tucked it into the beak. The gesture was small, but it warmed him, a reminder that not all of Cremona saw him as a harbinger of death. The square was still silent, its stalls empty, but Matteo imagined it alive again, vendors shouting, children laughing, Clara tossing him an apple. The vision was fleeting, but it fueled his steps as he moved toward the next summons, a house where a fever raged. His staff tapped the cobblestones, its rhythm steadier now, driven by the memory of Lucia's bread, Elena's hum, the rosemary sprig. The plague was relentless, but so was Cremona's heart, and Matteo clung to that truth. However fragile. Home, Clara waited, the fire low but steady. The mask sat on the table, its beak glinting in the firelight, now carrying the faint scent of rosemary. Matteo held up the loaf from Lucia, its crust still warm. "They lived," he said, his voice soft but firm. Clara's eyes brightened, her hand finding his. "Then there's hope," she said, her voice a lifeline. They broke the bread together, its taste simple but profound, a reminder of life amidst the ashes. The bells tolled, but for once Matteo heard them as a call to endure, not just to mourn. As night fell, Matteo lay awake, the mask's silhouette a quiet presence in the corner. The survivors, Lucia's children, the merchant, the young woman, were lanterns in his mind, small but bright. Tomorrow would bring more summons, more losses, but also the chance for more victories. However small, Matteo's doubt lingered, but defiance burned stronger now, kindled by the lives that held on against the darkness. The faint glow of hope, kindled by the survivors in Cremona, lingered in Matteo Rossi's heart like the rosemary sprig tucked into his plague doctor's mask. The cathedral bells tolled through the night, their rhythm softer now, as if the town itself were catching its breath. Lucia's warm bread, Elena's hummed tune, and the merchant's steadier breaths had been lanterns in the darkness, small victories against the plague's relentless shadow. Yet the weight of Matteo's staff, the memory of Chiara's tearful plea, and the ashes of burned homes still pressed against his soul. The Po River's mist hung low, carrying the scent of smoke and a whisper of change, a sign that the plague might be waning. Settle in, let the firelight soften, and walk with Matteo as he reflects on the scars left behind, weaving the resilience of Cremona's past into the echoes of our present. The morning was quiet, the air crisp with a chill that hinted at autumn. Matteo donned his mask, its beak heavy with lavender, thyme, and the faint rosemary gifted by a grateful stranger. His cloak, stained with soot and damp, rustled as he stepped into the streets, his staff tapping a rhythm that felt less burdened. Today the summons had slowed, fewer cries pierced the dawn, fewer red crosses marked the doors. Word had spread through Cremona's alleys. The plague was retreating, its grip loosening like a fever breaking. Matteo's heart lifted, but caution tempered his hope. He'd seen too many false dawns, too many lives slip away despite fleeting. Signs of recovery. His first visit was to Lucia's house. The unmarked door, a rare beacon in a town scarred by crimson crosses. He knocked, his staff's thud, gentle, and Lucia opened the door, her face weary but bright. Her children, Matteo and Elena, sat at a table, sharing a loaf of bread, their laughter soft but alive. "They're stronger every day," Lucia said, her voice warm with gratitude. Matteo checked their pulses, their skin clear of sores, their eyes bright with life. He offered a fresh tonic, its herbal scent mingling with the bread's warmth. And for a moment, the room felt like Cremona before, the plague a place of hope, not despair. "Thank you," Lucia said, her hand brushing his glove. Matteo nodded, the mask hiding his smile, and left with a lightness he hadn't felt in weeks. The streets were different now, the mist thinner, the smoke less choking. A few vendors had returned to the market square, their stalls sparse but open, offering apples and wilted greens. A child ran past, chasing a stray dog, his laughter a faint echo of the town's lost rhythm. Matteo paused, his staff grounded, and watched as a woman haggled over a basket of pears, her voice sharp but alive. The market was stirring, its heartbeat faint but present, and Matteo clung to the sight like a lifeline. He thought of Antonio's wooden spoon, of Chiara's empty pallet, and wondered if they, too, might find a place in this fragile rebirth. Yet the scars remained. As Matteo walked, he passed homes still marked with red crosses, their shutters closed, their silence a reminder of those who hadn't survived. At a weaver's house, he found the door ajar, the air inside cold and still. The family was gone, their belongings burned, only a single thread of blue wool caught in the floorboards. Matteo knelt, his gloved fingers tracing the thread, its color vivid against the ash. He thought of the weaver's tearful eyes, of the fires he'd overseen, and the weight of his staff returned, a reminder of the lives he couldn't save. The day brought more signs of recovery. A merchant whose fever had broken days ago greeted Matteo with a weak smile, offering a cup of watered wine. A young woman, her sores faded, sat by a window, sewing a patch onto a worn cloak. Matteo applied poultices where needed, his movements steady, but his notebook filled with cautious hope. Fewer fevers, fewer lumps, fewer tolls of the bells. Yet each victory was shadowed by loss. At a carpenter's house he found the boy Luca gone, his mother's prayers unanswered, her pallet empty. Matteo stood in the doorway, the red cross glaring, and felt the familiar sting of failure. By dusk, Matteo stood in the cathedral square, the mist curling around his boots. The crowd was smaller now, their faces less angry, though Father Gru's voice still carried from the church steps, preaching repentance to a weary flock. Matteo's mask drew fewer stares, the townsfolk's fears softened by the plague's retreat. A man approached, his hands rough from work, and offered a small sack of grain. "For your wife," he said, his voice low. Matteo took it, the gesture warming him, a sign that Cremona's heart was mending. However slowly, the square was still quiet, but a lantern glowed at one stall, its light cutting through the mist. Matteo thought of the market as it once was, Clara's laughter, the clink of coins, the scent of fresh bread. That world was gone, but its echo remained, carried in the vendor's tentative return, in Lucia's children, in the grain in his... And the plague had left scars, empty homes, silent streets, faces he'd never forget, but it hadn't taken everything. Cremona's resilience, like the lantern's light, burned on, fragile but unyielding. At home, Clara waited, the fire, steady and warm. Matteo set the mask on the table, its beak glinting with rosemary's faint scent. He handed her the sack of grain, and her eyes brightened. "They're coming back," she said, her voice soft but sure. Matteo nodded, breaking a piece of Lucia's bread, its taste a reminder of life enduring. "Some are," he said, his voice steady. They sat together, the bells quieter now, their toll no longer a dirge but a call to remember. Matteo thought of Chiara, of Antonio, of the weaver's blue thread, and saw their faces not just as loss but as part of Cremona's story, a story of survival, of scars that told of strength. As night fell, Matteo lay awake, the mask silhouette a quiet presence. The plague had changed him, as it had changed Cremona. He was no longer just a physician but a witness to a town's endurance, a keeper of its echoes. The scars would remain, but so would the lanterns, the small, stubborn lights that held the darkness at bay. And as he closed his eyes, he saw not just the ashes of the past but the promise of a future, fragile but real, connecting Cremona's resilience to the world we know today. The echoes of Cremona's resilience lingered in Matteo Rossi's heart. The memory of Lucia's warm bread and the faint laughter in the reviving market square, a fragile promise of renewal. The cathedral bells, once a dirge for the fallen, now rang with a softer cadence, marking not just loss but the slow return of life. The plague doctor's mask, its beak still carrying the scent of lavender, thyme, and rosemary, sat quietly on Matteo's table, a relic of a battle fought and survived. The Po River's mist, thinner now, carried a hint of hope as Cremona stirred from its long nightmare. Yet the scars remained: Chiara's tearful plea, Antonio's wooden spoon, the ashes of burned homes, and Matteo knew the town's healing was only beginning. Settle in, let the firelight glow, and walk with him as he steps into a new dawn, weaving the past's lessons into a future forged by endurance. The morning was crisp, the air clean with the scent of damp earth and budding vines, a sign that winter was yielding to spring. Matteo left the mask behind, its weight no longer needed, and stepped into the streets with only his staff, its wood worn smooth by countless summons. His cloak, still stained with soot, felt lighter today, as if the plague's shadow had lifted. The council had called him to the Guildhall, not for a grim decree but to discuss rebuilding, markets to reopen, homes to repair, lives to restore. Matteo's heart lifted at the thought, though the memory of red-crossed doors and silent cries tempered his hope. The Guildhall was brighter now, its windows open to let in the morning light. Lorenzo, the councilman, stood at the table, his stern face softened by exhaustion and relief. "The plague is fading," he said, his voice steady. "We need you to guide the recovery, ensure the sick are truly well. Help us bring the people back." Matteo nodded, his staff grounded on the stone floor. He thought of Lucia's children, their laughter a spark in the darkness, and of the market's tentative revival. "I'll do what I can," he said, his voice clear without the mask's muffling beak. Lorenzo clasped his shoulder, a rare gesture. "You've done more than most." Matteo's first task was to visit the survivors, to confirm their recovery, and ease the town's lingering fear. He walked to Lucia's house, where the air now smelled of fresh bread and hope. She greeted him with a smile, her children playing nearby, their voices bright. "They're strong again," she said, offering a loaf, its crust warm in Matteo's hands. He checked their pulses, their skin clear, their eyes alive with the resilience that had carried Cremona through its darkest days. "Keep them warm," he said, his physician's instinct steady, "and call me if the fever returns." Lucia nodded, her gratitude a quiet light in her eyes. The streets were stirring, the mist parting to reveal a town awakening. Vendors returned to the market square, their stalls sparse but growing apples, herbs, a bolt of blue cloth that reminded Matteo of the weaver's thread caught in the ashes. A child chased a ball across the cobblestones, his laughter a faint echo of Cremona's past. Matteo paused, his staff still, and watched as a woman bartered for a basket of pears, her voice sharp but alive. The market was not what it was, but it was enough a heartbeat, faint but steady, pulsing through the town's scars. Yet the past lingered. Matteo passed a house with a faded red cross, its door ajar, its rooms empty. He thought of Chiara now, living with a neighbor, her mother's pallet burned to ash. He'd seen her in the square days ago, clutching a woven basket, her eyes distant but unbroken. Matteo had stopped, offering a small coin, but she'd shaken her head, her voice soft. "I'll weave like Mama," she said, a spark of defiance in her grief. Matteo carried her words now, a reminder that Cremona's people were rebuilding, not just their homes but their spirits. The day brought more visits, each a thread in the town's slow mending. A merchant, now walking without a cough, offered Matteo a cup of wine, its taste sharp and grounding. A young woman, her sores healed, sewed by a window, her needle steady as she repaired a torn cloak. Matteo checked their health, his notebook filling with signs of recovery: stronger pulses, clearer skin, breaths unlabored, but the losses were never far. At a carpenter's house, he found the mother alone, her son Luca gone, her eyes hollow but dry. "He's with God," she said, her voice steady. Matteo nodded, his hand resting on hers. The weight of his failure a quiet ached out by dusk. Matteo stood in the cathedral square, the air clear now, the stars visible through the thinning mist. The bells rang, their sound no longer a dirge but a call to gather. A small crowd formed, their faces softer, their fear fading. Father Gregorio stood on the church steps, his voice gentler now, speaking of gratitude and renewal. His eyes met Matteo's, no longer sharp with disdain but tempered by shared loss. "We survived," he said, and the crowd murmured, some nodding, others clasping hands. Matteo stood at the edge, his staff grounded, feeling not like an outcast, but a part of Cremona's fragile whole. A boy approached Antonio, the baker's son, his wooden spoon tucked into his belt. "Will you stay?" he asked, his voice small but clear. Matteo knelt, his cloak brushing the stones. "I'll stay," he said, the words a promise to the boy, to Cremona, to himself. Antonio's smile was faint but real, a lantern in the dusk. Matteo rose, the weight of his staff lighter now, its rhythm a song of endurance. At home, Clara waited, the fire bright and warm. Matteo set his staff against the wall, the mask untouched, a relic of a battle won. He handed her the loaf, from Lucia, and they broke it together, its taste a reminder of life's persistence. "It's over," Clara said, her voice soft but sure. Matteo nodded, his hand finding hers. "Not over," he said, "but different." The bells rang, their echo carrying through the night, a testament to Cremona's scars and strength. That he lay awake. Matteo saw the lanterns of Cremona survivors, Lucia's children, Antonio's spoon, Chiara's woven basket. The plague had taken much, but it had left resilience, a legacy of endurance that connected Cremona's past to the world we know today. The mist had lifted, and in its place, a new dawn glowed, fragile but unyielding. As we close this epilogue, Let Cremona's lanterns shine, a testament to a town reborn. If you've enjoyed this journey through a world scarred but enduring, subscribe if you liked the video, and join us for more stories that weave the past into our present.